The order came through at 0347 ship time, all capitals, no condolences, and the Fleet Master's voice cracked halfway through the transmission, not from static, but from something the Xylos had never been bred to feel. Shame. The evacuation convoy would reverse course immediately. All vessels were to abandon extraction protocols and return to the safety of the Syndicate Armada. The children on the transport hauler were still crying when the order repeated, and that was when Captain Soren Vasseur of the Terran Independent Corps did something no other pilot in the assembled fleet dared. He switched off his comms and kept flying. The rift behind him pulsed with the sick orange light of a collapsing jump corridor, and ahead, the evacuation platform, designated Haven 9, was already venting atmosphere from 3 separate breaches. The children weren't supposed to be there. None of the civilians were. The entire operation had been a lie sold to the crews, a routine supply transfer, minimal risk, in and out before the Myrid Collective could push past the outer defense grid. But the Myrid hadn't pushed. They had swarmed. And somewhere in the chaos of the last 12 hours, a convoy of orphan transports had diverted to Haven 9 because they had nowhere else to go. Now there were 437 children between the ages of 3 and 16, none of them combat capable, none of them with guardians or sponsors or anyone who had volunteered to die in their place. And the fleet was leaving. Soren's cockpit smelled like recycled air and his own sweat. The Kestrel wasn't built for this, a reconnaissance fighter with light armor and a weapons package designed for harassment, not defense. But the Kestrel had something the larger vessels lacked. It had a human pilot, and humans, as the Syndicate had learned across 3 centuries of uneasy alliance, did not process abandonment the same way other species did. Pilot Vasseur, this is Fleet Master Threll. You are ordered to reverse course immediately. Your vessel is not authorized for solo extraction. Repeat, you are not. Soren keyed the transmit button. Fleet Master, I have visual on Haven 9's primary docking collar. It's intact. I can latch and begin evac within 8 minutes. So you cannot, Threll said. And now the shame was gone, replaced by something colder. Exasperation. The universal frustration of a superior dealing with a subordinate who refused to understand the math. The Myrid Vanguard is 73 minutes behind you. By the time you dock, you will have 45 minutes to load passengers and clear the blast radius. The Kestrel has capacity for 12. 12, pilot, not 400. Do you understand what you are proposing? Soren understood perfectly. He understood that 12 children would live and the rest would die. He understood that the Syndicate had already made that calculation and found it acceptable because 400 orphaned refugees from a species nobody had heard of until 6 years ago did not factor into the strategic balance. He understood that Threll was not a monster. He was an administrator, and administrators existed to make the ugly decisions so the rest of the galaxy could sleep. But Soren was not an administrator. He was a pilot, and pilots existed to fly into the burning places where everyone else refused to go. Fleet Master, he said, how many ships are in your evacuation convoy? A pause. 12, including the Kestrel. And how many are still en route to Haven 9? Another pause, longer this time. None. You are the last. Soren felt something settle in his chest. Not resolve exactly. Something raw. Something that felt like the moment before a crash, when all the screaming stopped, and the only thing left was the terrible clarity of knowing exactly what you were about to lose. Then I'm the only chance those kids have, he said, and I'm not turning back. He cut the channel and pushed the throttle forward. Haven 9 grew in his viewport like a dying star. The platform had been a refueling station once, a small speck of civilization in a system that had no strategic value until the Myrid decided to make it one. Now its outer hull was scarred with plasma burns, and the emergency beacons painted the void in alternating pulses of red and white. Soren could see the children through the observation blister, small shapes pressed against the transparasteel, hands flat against the glass, faces he couldn't read at this distance but didn't need to. He had seen those faces before. On Earth, during the last war before the Syndicate arrived, in the shelters beneath Moscow, in the shipping containers outside Jakarta, in the school gymnasium in a town called Greenville that no longer existed on any map. Children waiting for someone to come back. Children learning in real time that the adults had lied when they said they would never be left behind. The Kestrel shuddered as it entered the debris field. Pieces of the defense grid, what was left of it, spun past his cockpit, and Soren navigated through the wreckage with the kind of muscle memory that came from 1,000 hours of sims and 100 hours of real combat. The Syndicate had never understood human pilots. Other species fought with formations and protocols and mathematically optimal firing solutions. Humans fought like they were already dead and just hadn't gotten around to admitting it yet. "Docking in 3 minutes," he said to no one. "Hold on, kids, I'm coming." The primary docking collar was intact, but barely. The seal had been compromised, and Soren could see atmosphere bleeding out in thin, crystalline plumes that sparkled in the emergency lighting. He would have to override the automated clamps and force a manual lock, which meant exiting his cockpit and crossing the umbilical in an EVA suit, while the platform's compromised gravity tried to throw him into the void. He did it anyway. The umbilical was the longest 90 seconds of his life. The suit's magnetic boots kept him anchored, but every step felt like walking across the skin of a bomb. Behind him, the Kestrel's engines idled with a low, patient hum, waiting, like a horse that knew its rider would return. Ahead, the inner airlock cycled open, and Soren stepped into Haven 9's main concourse just as a girl no older than 7 ran into his legs and wrapped her arms around his knee. She didn't say anything. She just held on, and the sound she made was small and broken and absolutely silent, because she had already learned that screaming didn't bring help. Soren knelt down. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here." The girl looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, and Soren saw the exact moment she decided to believe him. It wasn't relief. It was something more desperate, the decision to hope because the alternative was unbearable. "There are more," she whispered. "So many more. They're scared." "I know," Soren said, "but we don't have much time, so I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" She nodded. "Good girl. Go find everyone you can and bring them to the docking collar. Tell them we're leaving. Tell them I have room for 12. Her face crumpled. "Only 12? Soren felt his throat close. "Only 12 right now," he said, and hated himself for the lie. "But I'll come back, I promise." The girl ran, and Soren stood up and looked at the rest of the children already gathering at the edges of the concourse. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all ages and species, but mostly humanoid, mostly small, mostly watching him with the same terrible calculation that Threll had used. They were counting. They were doing the math. And they knew, even if no one had told them, that 12 was not enough. The first group boarded without incident. 12 children between the ages of 6 and 10, herded into the Kestrel's cramped cargo bay by a young Xylos boy who took charge with the quiet authority of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. Soren sealed the hatch, cycled the airlock, and launched away from Haven 9 with 12 small bodies pressed against the bulkheads, breathing recycled air and trying not to cry. Behind him, the platform grew smaller. Ahead, the fleet was already gone. Just a fading heat signature on the edge of his sensors, running for the jump point. He could still catch them. The Kestrel was fast. He could deliver these 12 children to safety and tell himself he had done what he could. He didn't. He turned the Kestrel around and flew back. "Pilot Vasseur, this is Fleet Master Threll. I am monitoring your trajectory. Explain." Soren didn't answer. He was already calculating the turnaround time. 4 minutes to dock, 3 to load, 2 to clear the platform, and then he would have to push the engines past their rated tolerance to shave another minute off the return trip. He could make 3 runs before the Myrid arrived, maybe 4 if the children loaded faster each time. 36 children, maybe 48, and then the rest would die. "Pilot Vasseur, I am ordering you to return to the fleet. You have fulfilled your obligation. Further attempts at extraction are statistically meaningless." Statistically meaningless. Soren almost laughed. That was the problem with the Syndicate. They had never learned that statistics meant nothing to a human who had looked a child in the eyes and promised to come back. The second run was harder. The docking collar had degraded further during his absence, and the seal failed completely as he was cycling the airlock. He had to latch directly to the platform's emergency override port, which meant the children would have to cross the vacuum in EVA suits, assuming there were enough suits. There weren't. Soren found the storage locker himself, ripped it open with a crowbar from his survival kit, and started handing out suits to the youngest first. The older children helped the smaller ones seal their helmets. No one panicked. No one screamed. They just worked, because panic was a luxury they couldn't afford, and somewhere in the last hour, they had stopped being children and started being survivors. "How many trips?" asked the Xylo's boy from the first group. He had stayed behind to help. His name was Kale, and he was 11 years old. "As many as I can make," Soren said. "The Myriad will be here in—" "I know." Kyle looked at him. "You're going to die." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even fear. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat certainty that soldiers used when discussing casualties. Soren knelt down. "Maybe," he said, "but not before I get as many of you out as I can. That's the deal. That's the only deal I have to offer." Kyle studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Then let's work faster." The second run took 22 children, everyone who could fit in the cargo bay after the suits were accounted for. Soren launched with the emergency override still attached, tearing a chunk of the platform's hull away in the process, and the Kestrel screamed in protest as he pushed the engines past every safety margin the manufacturer had ever designed. Behind him, the platform bled atmosphere into the void. Ahead, the first Myriad scouts were already appearing on his sensors, fast, angular ships with weapons that could carve through his armor like paper. "Pilot Vasseur, the Myriad Vanguard has accelerated. You have 11 minutes before they reach weapons range. You cannot make another extraction." Soren checked the clock. 11 minutes. Enough time to dock, load, and launch if he pushed the Kestrel to its breaking point and didn't care what was left of it afterward. "Watch me," he said. The third run was chaos. The platform's gravity generator failed during docking, and Soren had to guide the children across the umbilical in 0G, one hand braced against the wall, the other catching small bodies as they floated past. The older children formed a chain, passing the younger ones hand over hand, and Soren realized with a jolt that they had been practicing. They had been preparing for this moment since the first run, because somewhere in the last hour they had stopped waiting to be saved and started saving themselves. 43 children made it onto the Kestrel. 43 plus the 22 from the second run, plus the 12 from the first. 77. Not 400, not even close, but 77 children who would live because one human pilot had refused to do the math. The Myriad arrived as Soren was disengaging from the docking port. Their weapons fire missed the Kestrel by less than 100 meters, and the shockwave sent the ship spinning into the debris field. Soren fought the controls, bleeding velocity, dodging wreckage, and somehow, impossibly, brought the ship back under control just as a second volley carved through the space where he had been. He was out of time. The platform was still there behind him, still burning, still full of children, who had watched the Kestrel disappear into the darkness and knew with the terrible certainty of the abandoned that no one was coming back. Soren knew it too, and that was when he made a decision that no syndicate officer would have understood. He turned the Kestrel around one last time, and this time he didn't stop at the docking collar. He flew straight into the platform's hangar bay, crash-landed on the deck, and blew the emergency release on every cargo door he had. "Everyone on board," he shouted. "Now everyone! No suits, no gear, just get on the ship." The children flooded through the hatches like water through a broken dam. They didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. They just climbed over each other, packed into every available space. The cargo bay, the cockpit, the maintenance crawl space, the compartments that weren't designed to hold anything larger than a survival kit. They stacked themselves 3 deep against the walls. They held each other. They breathed the same air and occupied the same space and made themselves small so that someone else could fit. Soren counted as they boarded. He couldn't help it. The numbers were burned into his brain, and even now, with the Myriad closing in and the ship's hull groaning under the strain, he couldn't stop calculating. 211, 212, 213. The ship's weight sensors screamed at him. The thrusters were already past their tolerance. The hull was buckling in places where too many bodies pressed against too little armor. The Kestrel was never designed for this. It was a scalpel, not a lifeboat, and Soren was asking it to do the impossible. He didn't care. He slammed the throttle forward, and the Kestrel launched out of the burning hangar bay with 437 children on board. The ship didn't fly. It staggered. Every system was redlining, every alarm was shrieking, and the hull was making sounds that Soren had never heard in 12 years of flying. The mirrored ships were everywhere now. Not just scouts, but the full vanguard, a wall of death spreading across the system like a net. Soren looked at his tactical display. The fleet was gone. The jump point was 3 minutes away at maximum speed, but the Kestrel couldn't make maximum speed. Not with this much mass, not with this much damage. He would be lucky to make half that. Behind him, the children were crying again. Not all of them. Some were silent. Some were praying in languages he didn't recognize. Some were holding each other. And one, a small girl with dark hair and desperate eyes, was standing in the cockpit doorway watching him fly. "Are we going to die?" she asked. Soren looked at her, at all of them, at the 437 reasons he had just signed his own death warrant. "No," he said. "We're not." He didn't know how he was going to keep that promise, but he was human, and humans had been making impossible promises since the first Cavalier looked at the first child and said, "I will keep you safe," knowing full well that the world was full of things that wanted to break that promise. The Myrid opened fire. The first volley hit the Kestrel's port engine, and the ship lurched hard enough to throw children across the cargo bay. Soren compensated, pouring power into the starboard thrusters, but the ship was already dying. He could feel it in the stick, in the vibration, in the way the hull sang with the frequency of imminent collapse. "Brace!" he shouted, and then he did something that should have been impossible. He flew into the debris field. The wreckage of the defense grid was still spinning through the void, thousands of pieces of shattered metal, some as small as his fist, some as large as the Kestrel itself. No sane pilot would enter that field at this speed. No sane pilot would even try. But Soren wasn't flying sane anymore. He was flying human, and there was a difference. The Myrid ships followed him in. They had to. The debris field was the only cover between the Kestrel and the jump point, and if Soren could make it to the other side, he could slingshot around the system's gravity well and buy himself enough distance to punch through. But the Myrid were faster, more agile. They didn't have 400 extra bodies weighing them down. The first hit came from behind, a plasma bolt that glanced off the Kestrel's aft armor and sent a spray of molten metal across the cargo bay. Children screamed. Soren felt the ship's power distribution flicker, and for one terrible second, he thought the engines were gone. They weren't. Not yet. He pushed the throttle harder, weaving through the debris with millimeters to spare, and the Myrid ships fell behind, not because they were slower, but because they were cautious. They calculated the odds of collision and found them unacceptable. They made the rational choice. Soren didn't have that luxury. He had 437 children on board, and rationality had no place in a ship that full. The jump point was 30 seconds away when the Kestrel's starboard engine finally failed. The ship spun, and Soren fought the controls with both hands, kicking in the emergency thrusters, burning through his remaining fuel in a desperate bid to correct his trajectory. 20 seconds. 15. 10. The Myrid were closing. Their weapons were charging. Soren could see the glow building on their forward emplacements, the kind of glow that meant the next volley wouldn't just disable his ship, it would vaporize it. He looked at the girl in the cockpit doorway. She was still watching him, still trusting him, still believing that the strange human pilot who had flown back when everyone else left would find a way to keep his promise. Soren smiled at her. It was a terrible smile, the smile of a man who had run out of options and decided to make one anyway. "Hold on," he said. And then he flew the Kestrel into the jump point at an angle that should have torn the ship apart, with an engine configuration that should have been impossible at a speed that every calculator in the galaxy would have called suicide. The jump ripped through the ship like a scream. The children felt it in their bones, the sudden compression, the impossible pressure, the sense of being stretched across light years in the span of a heartbeat. The Kestrel's hull groaned. The lights flickered. The air grew thin and cold. And then it was over. They emerged on the other side of the Syndicate border in a system so quiet and empty that Soren almost didn't believe it was real. The fleet was there, waiting, watching, broadcasting a general distress call that had already been picked up by 3 rescue vessels. The Kestrel drifted into the formation with its engines dead, its hull cracked, and its cockpit full of the sound of 437 children crying with relief. Fleetmaster Threll's face appeared on the comm screen. He looked older than he had an hour ago, older and smaller and somehow diminished, as if the weight of what he had ordered had finally settled into his bones. "Pilot Vasseur," he said, "you are the most infuriating being I have ever commanded." Soren laughed. It came out as a cough. "Thank you, sir." It was not a compliment. "I know." Threll stared at him for a long moment. Behind him, Soren could see the bridge crew, Xylos, Tarn, and half a dozen other species, all watching the human pilot with expressions that ranged from disbelief to awe. They had never seen anything like this. They had never imagined that anyone would try. "How did you survive?" Threll asked finally. Soren looked down at the girl still standing in his cockpit doorway. She had stopped crying. She was looking at him with eyes that no longer held the weight of abandonment, because someone had finally kept the promise that everyone else had broken. "I had a reason," he said. The rescue vessels arrived 23 minutes later. The children were transferred in groups of 50, carefully, gently, with medics waiting to check for injuries and counselors standing by to offer comfort. Soren watched from the Kestrel's shattered cockpit as the last of them filed onto the transport, small figures in ill-fitting EVA suits, holding hands, looking back at the tiny human ship that had carried them across the void. Kyle was the last to leave. The Xylos boy stopped at the airlock and turned around. He was 11 years old, and he had helped save 437 lives by refusing to panic when every adult in his life had already given up. "Pilot Vasseur," he said. "Yeah? What you did, is that what all humans would do?" Soren thought about it. He thought about the soldiers in Moscow and the volunteers in Jakarta, and the teacher in Greenville who had stayed in the burning school until every child was out. He thought about all the people who had ever looked at impossible odds and made the choice that didn't make sense because the alternative was unthinkable. "No," he said, "not all humans, but enough. That's what makes us who we are." Kyle nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal token, a pilot's insignia, the kind that syndicate officers gave to their children as good luck charms. He pressed it into Soren's hand. "I want you to have this," he said, "so you remember." "Remember what?" Kyle smiled. It was a small smile, fragile and new, but it was real. "That you came back." He stepped through the airlock, and the transport sealed behind him. And Soren was alone on a ship that would never fly again, holding a token he hadn't earned and didn't deserve, surrounded by the silence of 437 children who were still alive because one human pilot had refused to do the math. The fleet returned to Syndicate space 3 days later. The Kestrel was towed into dry dock and officially decommissioned, too damaged to repair, too valuable to scrap. Someone carved a plaque for the hull. It said nothing about speed or firepower or tactical efficiency. It said, "She came back." Soren Vasseur received a commendation, a promotion, and an offer to transfer to any vessel in the Syndicate fleet. He declined them all. He stayed on the border, flying patrols in a new ship with the same name, watching the dark for the next impossible rescue. And somewhere in the galaxy, on a colony world that had taken in 437 refugees, a Xylos boy named Kale grew up to become a pilot himself. He never forgot the human who had flown back when the fleet turned away. He never forgot the sound of children crying, or the way hope felt when it arrived in a ship too small for the weight it carried. He never forgot that somewhere out there, a human was still watching, still waiting, still coming back. And that, more than any weapon or strategy or diplomatic alliance, was why humanity mattered. Not because they were strong, not because they were brave, but because when every calculator in the galaxy said abandon, a human looked at the numbers and said, "No, no, I will not leave them. No, I will not do the math. No, I will not turn back while one child is still crying in the dark." The fleet learned a lesson that day. The Syndicate learned it too. And somewhere in the vast, cold void of space, the Myriad Collective learned something they had never understood before. Humans didn't fight for territory or resources or revenge. They fought for the promise they made to a child who was too young to understand why everyone else had left, and they never, ever broke that promise. The Kestrel's plaque still hangs in the Dry Dock Museum on Syndicate Prime. Visitors pass it every day, Xylos, Tarn, and a dozen other species who came to the stars seeking logic and found instead a human who refused to calculate the odds. They read the words carved into the hull. She came back, and they wonder sometimes if anyone would come back for them. The answer, written in the flight path of a dying ship and the tears of 437 children, is the same answer it has always been. Yes, a human would.